Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the book log. Today I'm talking about one of the most famous novels of all time, Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky. There's really no point in reviewing a book like this except for as a way for me personally to organize my thoughts and try to put everything together in a way that makes sense for me so I don't literally forget what happened, so I can kind of sit down and think about what I read and how I interpreted it. No one watching this is probably going to glean any sort of novel insight or unique commentary or anything. This is a book that has been very well discussed for like 150 years. One thing that makes it difficult to talk about this book is that there's not really a lot of plot. Plot does still occur. There are a variety of interesting characters getting up to a variety of things throughout the story, but I think it's clear that Dostoevsky is really more concerned with taking the crime at the center of this book and exploring its philosophy, its implications, and the various ways that it affects the characters of the story, as opposed to exploring those ideas through a more structured narrative. There are a bunch of really great, really incredible scenes and sequences throughout the story, but they never really coalesce into one interconnected string of events, which is kind of a bit strange actually, considering this book largely takes place over the course of just a few days. To be honest, most of what occurs in this book is just characters interacting with one another, going from place to place and having conversations, philosophizing, pontificating, which in itself still manages to be pretty engaging. Apparently, Dostoevsky had two different story ideas and ended up weaving them together to create Crime and Punishment. And so in order to discuss a plot, I'll probably refer to the following two storylines. The first is the one that everyone knows. Rodion Raskolnikov Romanovich, or Rodia, is a former university student living impoverished in St. Petersburg, Russia, and he commits a double axe murder. He kills an old pawnbroker woman named Alyona Ivanovna, as well as her sister, Lizaveta. He did not plan to kill Lizaveta originally, but he felt forced to because she unexpectedly saw the first murder and he didn't want to leave any witnesses. This act happens pretty early on into the book, and the majority of the rest of the story is Raskolnikov navigating the aftermath of this crime, his extreme paranoia, anxiety, guilt, as well as the various philosophical arguments Raskolnikov has created to justify this act to himself and to others. After the murders, Raskolnikov does himself absolutely no favors in terms of laying low. In fact, he acts extremely suspicious and almost goes out of his way to implicate himself in the crime several times, despite simultaneously feeling intensely paranoid about getting caught. He gets quiet and pale every time the murders are even mentioned. He returns to the crime scene just a couple days later and is making remarks about where all the blood went. He literally outlines precise details of the crime to several people while framing it as a hypothetical scenario, oh, if I had done the crime, I would have done it this way. And then on top of all that, it's also revealed that he had previously authored a newspaper article which details the moral justifications of the exact type of crime that he would go on to commit, which is important, and I'll talk about that later. Obviously, a lot of this suspicious behavior is a manifestation of all the guilt he feels, and that in itself, you could say, is also a part of the plot, I suppose. The other plot line here is a little more nebulous, and it is deeply intertwined with the first one. Basically, Raskolnikov meets this drunk in a tavern named Marmeladov. He's this former civil servant who has drunk himself and his family into complete destitution. And the book spends a lot of time detailing the subsequent miserable situation that his wife and kids are left in. His wife, Katerina Ivanovna, slowly deteriorates throughout the book, both physically and mentally. And his daughter, Sonia, who is forced into prostitution in order to support her family, becomes an extremely important figure to Raskolnikov as she kind of tries to drag him to redemption. She's the first character Raskolnikov confesses to, and despite being friends with Lizaveta, who he murdered, she manages to be pretty compassionate and forgiving towards him. She's the one who tries to get him to confront his own sins and his own guilt as a way out of the immense turmoil that he has created for himself. And as a side note, this is kind of the storyline where I think Dostoevsky seems to be most directly making a commentary on Russian society and specifically St. Petersburg. Its moral decay, its harsh economic conditions, the way it chews up and spits out this formerly noble family is described in incredibly harrowing detail. Now, the other massive component to this story, I would say, is Raskolnikov's philosophical justifications for the murders. These are laid out very clearly and very often, and if I had to identify one singular point of the book, I guess it would be this. So like I mentioned earlier, Raskolnikov wrote this article earlier, like off page, that lays out the reasons that he thinks committing a crime like this is actually okay, and in fact even morally beneficial. First and foremost, Alyona Ivanovna, the old pawnbroker woman who he murdered, she was not a nice person. She was vile and mean and selfish, and she treated her tenants poorly. She hoarded wealth. She was just like a generally unpleasant person. So Raskolnikov argues that by killing her, he's actually doing the world a favor in some way. Like if he can take her wealth and distribute it to the surrounding poor, doesn't the virtue of that outweigh the evil of killing her? Is he doing more good than bad? Again, he also kills Alyona's sister, Elizaveta, who everyone likes and thinks is a good person, solely because she happens to walk in the room during the murder and he can't have any witnesses, but we'll ignore that little tidbit for the sake of this particular argument. The other layer to his argument is that some people are just above the law. In order to be a great man of history, like a mover and a shaker and like someone who's situated behind the levers of power, it's actually sometimes imperative to commit murder. And in most cases, no one cares. He frequently references Napoleon as an example of this, a man universally lauded for his greatness, his importance, his meaningful position in history, how much bloodshed was caused directly by Napoleon's hand. And not only that, but how much of that bloodshed was necessary to reach that position in the first place. If those things can be excused by the masses, then surely the simple killing of an evil pawnbroker lady and her sister can be excused as well, right? That's kind of the problem at the root of Raskolnikov's character. He can't let it go. He does actually feel guilt, however subconscious it may be, and he does actually feel the need to repent and to be redeemed. Like this very fact negates the entire argument of his article, because those great men he references, like Napoleon, they wouldn't care about that. They wouldn't feel remorse. They wouldn't feel the need to confess. They're acting without regard for civilized boundaries. The very thing that Raskolnikov is claiming makes them great is the one thing that he is unable to achieve. Because that mindset, the idea of ignoring the moral value of actions for a perceived greater good, is actually alienating and isolating, and it sends Raskolnikov further down the path of self-destruction. I should also mention, as a side note, that when I say guilt, I don't necessarily mean the same thing as remorse. Coming into this book, I thought Raskolnikov would be feeling a lot more sad and regretful, but it never really comes off that way. In fact, he outwardly maintains his innocence for most of the entire book. Instead, his guilt is more manifested by like making him go sick and crazy. In a more direct sense, you'll often see people talk about how Dostoevsky is criticizing the philosophy of utilitarianism, and that's kind of the point of this whole through line. Utilitarianism, the idea that the best action to take is the one which provides the greatest amount of good to the greatest amount of people, according to Dostoevsky, is bad, because for one, you can use it to justify heinous acts like the whole murder situation. Two, running the value of real human beings through some abstract morality calculator is kind of dehumanizing and weird. And three, Dostoevsky, just kind of a big old Christian, just a fan of his moral absolutes, at least in regards to actions, I guess, not so much entire people. As strange as it sounds to say, apart from the brutal murders he commits, Raskolnikov is actually portrayed as kind of a nice, sensitive guy, or at the very least, like a human being with a conscience. He supports Sonia and Katerina Ivanovna financially while their lives are crumbling due to the death of Marmeladov. He's compassionate towards his friend Razumikin. He loves and cares deeply about his mother, Pulcheria, and his sister, Dunya. But for some reason, Raskolnikov is in denial about his own nature. He wants to be this great man who's above the law, but he can't abandon his humanity. Like, he wants to be compassionate, but he also wants to transcend conventional morality. And I guess this duality is sort of the root of his suffering throughout the book, you could say, his punishment, so to speak. So his redemption isn't just in the literal sense of turning himself in and spending years in Siberian exile to atone for his sins, but also to repent as in like abandon his delusions and accept himself as he actually is. This entire concept is mirrored in a super fascinating way through the character of Svidrigailov, who is this nobleman who's supposed to marry his sister Dunya, but ruined it for a whole variety of reasons that the book gets into. And as a character in this book, he's kind of a manifestation of the man Raskolnikov is describing in his paper, like an extraordinary person who believes he can transcend laws and ethics. But whereas Raskolnikov himself thought he could embody that man he was describing, he was ultimately too pathetic and too scared. Svidrigailov, on the other hand, did embody that man as somebody who acts without moral boundaries. But as a character, he demonstrates once again that the entire idea is flawed in the first place. He was able to avoid the guilt that tormented Raskolnikov, but he was also very lonely and unhappy and ultimately chose to end his own life. The psychology goes pretty deep in this book. There's a lot more to talk about. This is already kind of obnoxiously long, so I'm just going to talk about a couple scenes and moments throughout the book in particular that I enjoyed. One of my favorite scenes in the whole book is this funeral lunch set up by Katerina Ivanovna for her late husband. The whole event is just painfully tense and awkward and so weird. Katerina's like oscillating between berating her guests and then also being sad that no one showed up, but then like boasting to everybody about her noble lineage. And then in the middle of all this drama, Luzhin arrives to accuse Sonia of stealing 100 rubles from his apartment. So they go to check Sonia's pockets, and there is a 100 ruble note in there, but then immediately he's called out by his roommate for intentionally planting the money in her pocket so that he could deliberately humiliate her in front of everybody, and then he leaves the function in shame. The entire chapter was just so vivid and theatrical. It felt like I was watching a movie or like an episode from a sitcom or something like that, which is kind of funny to think about in Crime and Punishment. Another sort of recurring motif that I really enjoyed in this book were the several dream sequences scattered throughout. The first one is about Raskolnikov as a child walking through his hometown with his father and stumbling on this horrific scene of a horse getting mercilessly beaten to death. It's just incredibly vivid and sad and brutal, and it does a really great job of painting Raskolnikov as this compassionate, scared child, only to contradict it by having him immediately go on to commit the murders in like the chapter after. There's another dream sequence later on in the book where Raskolnikov is back in Alyona's apartment with the intention of killing her again, but this time she won't die. Like no matter how many times he hits her with the axe, she just sits there and laughs at him and mocks him for his inability to kill her. He can see people outside in the hallway just silently observing him as he does this, and the entire scene is so eerie and unsettling. It has such a nightmarish quality to it. It almost reads like horror, to be honest. There's a couple other interesting dreams as well, and I don't know, I just thought it was a really effective way for Dostoevsky to explore Raskolnikov's subconscious mind in addition to his conscious mind. I don't think I have a whole lot left to say. I enjoyed the book. I thought it was interesting and engaging. It certainly gets you thinking. It was different from what I expected too. It's not so much about what happens as it is about why what happens, if that makes sense. Dostoevsky really pokes and prods at human nature in a very fundamental, very essential way. And it's not always the most riveting story, like from an entertainment perspective, but it is fascinating from a psychological one. It's about morality and justice and guilt and redemption. It kind of makes you confront those things in a complex way. If you do the crime one way or another, you'll get the punishment, and that applies to all of us. I'd probably give this book like a solid 8.